Now, I'd like to show you a series of slides that appeared this year in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition that I think go a long way to explaining changes that we've seen in our population. So here is a graph showing that total sugar intake has skyrocketed in the past 160 years. I mean, this is a very dramatic graph, and it also shows the prevalence of obesity, which closely follows that trend. Now, notice that this is over the past 160 years. So I think a strong preference for sugar has been established in our culture for a very long time. I remember meeting, I think it was sometime in the early 1980s, a young woman, pastry chef, who had come to this country from Switzerland to work. And she said one of the first things she learned here was that she had to increase by half the amount of sugar in her recipes to make it taste right for Americans. So that's interesting to hear that perspective. That Americans like things sweeter than many other people. And yet at the same time, notice that in the slope of that rise, as we get towards 2000, greatly increases. This bears looking at. Why has intake of sugar gone up to this extent? And I think that at these conferences over the past several years, you have heard a number of experts talk about the relative dangers of sugar in the diet compared to fat and other things. There is great concern about the effects of sugar on health, especially because of its content of fructose, which we cannot metabolize, which deranges liver metabolism, and appears to be a chief driver of insulin resistance and the whole cascade of metabolic problems that follow from that. I would also say that it is important to learn the differences between different sweeteners, especially as to their fructose content. And as a dramatic example of that, the table sugar, sucrose, is half fructose. Fructose tastes very sweet to us, and yet it is very low on the glycemic index. And I have to say, this is a mistake evolution made. Something that cannot provide energy should not taste so sweet to us. Sweet taste should guide us to quick, instant sources of caloric energy. So this is some mistake in our wiring. I remember, probably this is still true, you could buy crystalline fructose in health food stores as a sweetener that had very few calories, but tasted sweeter than sucrose. That is not a good thing, nor is it a good thing that fructose ranks very low on the glycemic index scale. And what that shows, and this is a very important fact for you to remember, the glycemic index scale does not apply to sugars. You know, it breaks down when we look at sugars because of this very problem. And when you look, I think the glycemic index works very well for starches, for many kinds of carbohydrate foods. It does not apply to sugars. And when you're looking at the various sweeteners, what you want to know is what's the percentage of fructose. I have to say here again, I have great confidence in my sense of taste because my taste has always guided me to maple syrup as my preferred sweetener. That has about 35% fructose in it, which is the lowest of the common sweeteners. And you know what's right up at the top? It's agave nectar, which has been promoted as such a healthy sweetener, often 85% fructose. I think the overall message is that we want to reduce total consumption of sweeteners in our diet. We want to learn to prefer less sweet things to more sweet things, and this is a matter of changing your taste. And we want to use sweeteners in moderation, going for those with the lower content of fructose rather than the higher content of fructose. Paralleling this, a significant increase in the consumption of soda and fruit juice. And this is probably one of the main reasons why the slope of that sugar intake curve got so much steeper as we approached the year 2000. Because while a strong preference for sweet things, sweeter than many other people like, has been firmly established in our culture for a long time, I think this is a relatively recent change. And it is the quantities of these that are being drunk. When I was growing up, there was no such thing as a big gulp of soda that was offered in convenience stores or at movie theaters, let alone the fact that these giant-sized sodas would be cheaper to buy than smaller-sized sodas. Also, I have long said at these conferences that one of the great misconceptions out there in our culture is not understanding the difference between fruit and fruit juice. Fruit juice is a concentrated sugar source. When you leave the fiber in fruit behind, you dramatically increase the sugar concentration of what you're drinking. We've had at these conferences for several years as a presenter Robert Lustig, the pediatric endocrinologist at UC San Francisco, who's the main researcher of the effects of fructose on human metabolism. And he's made statements here that have been shocking to our audiences. He has said that drinking a glass of orange juice, whether fresh squeezed, frozen, or from concentrate, is no different from drinking a glass of Coca-Cola from the point of view of metabolism, insulin resistance. In California some years ago, when a grassroots movement got soda vending machines out of public schools, they were replaced with fruit juice vending machines. No difference. Many parents think it's great if their kids drink fruit juice ad lib. It is not. If when I look at the nutritional mess that we are in this country, and it is a vast mess, it's so tangled, it is hard to even know where we'd begin to try to change things on a policy level. Here's where I would start. If we could get people to stop drinking sweet liquids, that would put us so far ahead of the curve. People do not have to drink sweet liquids. You don't have to put sugar in coffee and tea. You don't have to drink sweet energy drinks. You don't have to consume fruit juice. You don't have to consume soda. That would be a very easy thing if we could just do something in any way we can, whether it's putting sin taxes on sodas, whether it's through education, which I'm a great believer in, but anything we can do to get people in this country to stop drinking sweet liquids, that would be a very good thing. Calorie intake has gone up around 400 calories per day. All right, why? I think here a big explanation has to do with portion sizes. Again, just as there were no big gulps of soda, when you went to movies when I was growing up, there was no such thing as a bucket of popcorn. You know, people got modest bags of popcorn. When you walk through airports, there weren't places offering cookies as big as your head. You know, these are remarkable changes that have happened in our population. They are signs of affluence. I also have to say that people from other cultures, notably Japan, which I have a lot of familiarity with, when they come here, they make fun of American portion sizes, but when these giant portions are put in front of them, huge smiles on their faces. You know, this is something that appeals. I mean, we have all evolved from populations that experience starvation frequently, or feast and famine. I think this is hardwired into us. There is something very reassuring and reinforcing about seeing enormous abundance of food right in front of us. But this now clearly is working against us. This is a very interesting one. People have abandoned traditional fats in favor of processed vegetable oils. I have been warning people about the dangers of processed vegetable oils for at least, I would say, 30 years, and I think I was one of the first people to do that. Traditional fats, things like lard, butter, which we began to think of as being really bad foods in the 1970s when we were obsessed with saturated fat and with high fat in general, and there was a strong tendency to think that vegetable oils were better for us. The problem is that many of these vegetable oils are highly polyunsaturated. Those oils are chemically unstable. They tend to oxidize. The oxidation products are strongly carcinogenic and pro-inflammatory. And this is, I think, a very significant factor on the increase of chronic diseases that are rooted in unchecked chronic low-level inflammation. Now, this is a remarkable headline of a graph to see in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition in 2014. People replaced heart-healthy butter with trans-fat-laden margarine. I mean, who would have ever heard the phrase heart-healthy butter in an American Journal of Clinical Nutrition before this year or the past 2 years? Remarkable. And as for margarine, who was responsible for getting people to eat margarine? We were medical doctors. It was medical doctors that urged people to eat margarine in the 1970s in the erroneous belief that this was a healthy alternative to butter. The history of margarine is fascinating. It was invented in the 1700s in France by a royal initiative during a butter shortage due to a cattle plague in Europe, and the French Academy of Sciences was urged to come up with a substitute for butter. What margarine was made of in those early days was disgusting. I mean, it was scraps from slaughterhouses, horrible kinds of fats. And it's only recommendation was that it was a replacement for butter which you couldn't get. Then, in the 1800s, the quality of margarine improved, but it was always marketed as a cheap substitute for butter. Somewhere in the early 1900s, the idea of using vegetable fats to create margarine came about, which made it a much more wholesome product. But still, its only virtue up through World War II was that it was a cheap substitute for butter. And the butter industry went to great lengths to discourage people from eating margarine and got laws passed that made it, for example, you couldn't sell margarine that was yellow. You could only sell margarine that was white, that looked like lard. And in some states, it was dyed bright pink. In other states, you could buy a capsule of artificial yellow dye that you could knead into the margarine at home, which made a streaky mess. But then what happened? Medical doctors reinvented margarine as a healthy alternative to butter, not a cheap substitute for it. And in the 1970s and 1980s, when I looked in refrigerators of my medical colleagues, I advise you, by the way, whenever you get into the homes of patients or other doctors, look in the refrigerators. That is the easiest way to determine quickly what people's eating habits are. I always found margarine there instead of butter. I never ate margarine. It tasted bad to me. And I always told people to be suspicious of it. And it's not just the trans fat problem. It's that the oils that go into margarine they have other problems with them. The chemical breakdown products of those oils also promote inflammation. It's not just causing heart disease. They promote inflammation. They promote cancer because of the nature of the compounds that are formed when they react with oxygen. So this was a very bad trend in our diet. Soybean oil has become a major source of calories. What's wrong with soybean oil? A lot. This is a cheap oil. Why is it cheap? It's cheap because our federal government makes it so, because it subsidizes soy. It's one of the 4 commodity crops that is subsidized. And it artificially drives down the price of soybean oil, which has made it ubiquitous in processed food and fast food. The problem with soybean oil, not only is it a major source of calories, and this is certainly one of the reasons why caloric intake has gone up, because all of the junk foods and snack foods that are out there in the middles of supermarkets and in convenience stores are made with soybean oil, but this is the major source, this is not in this graph, of excessive omega-6 fatty acids in our population. And this is a dramatic change. As you know, there is great reason to think that the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 fats that you eat is a important determinant of health, and in particular the effects of these on inflammation. That high omega-6 fat intake increases inflammatory changes in the body. It also increases simultaneously cell proliferation, which increases cancer risks. And there are many reasons why the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio has changed in our population. But one of the main ones is that our diets were flooded with refined soybean oil beginning in the 1920s and now greatly accelerated by the USDA's subsidy of soy, something that I would urge you all to try to end when the Farm Bill is debated, although on the past years, every time the Farm Bill issue has come up, we've lost on every point because we've been outstandingly out-lobbied by the vested interests that are benefiting from these subsidies. So this remains a big problem for us. Egg consumption has gone down. Who's responsible for that? We are. It was medical doctors who told people not to eat eggs because of worries that they were going to raise cholesterol. The poor egg industry really got bashed unfairly. Egg yolks are incredibly nutritious. They're sources of essential fatty acids, many other nutrients. Egg white omelets always tasted horrible to me. You know, go back to eating whole eggs if you want. I don't think there's anything we have to worry about. Eggs are nutritious, and as people reduced egg consumption, I think this is a very significant bad nutritional trend, again, that medical doctors have been chiefly responsible for. And here again, it comes back to me the fact that the medical profession has been so poorly educated on nutritional issues over the years that we have, unwittingly given people very poor advice that has often contributed to these trends that we're seeing happening in our culture. People are eating more processed foods than ever before. Obvious, right? I mean, you go into a convenience store in this country, what can you eat? You know, if I'm on a road trip, it's pretty bad out there if I don't have my own food with me. If I'm lucky, I can get a bag of dry roasted peanuts that don't have MSG in them. You know, otherwise it's bright blue slush going around in the thing, and almost every product that I pick up off the shelf has ingredients in it that I don't consider wholesome. It's the wrong kinds of carbohydrates, the wrong kinds of fats, additives that I consider unhealthy, and this is what people eat today. You know, Michael Pollan, whose books I'm sure many of you are familiar with, has said that our great-grandparents would not recognize as food most of what people eat today. And that's absolutely true. And to me, this is probably, of all the slides that we've seen here, this is the one that's most significant. That people are mostly eating today foods that are very far from what nature produces. And I think it's also striking that if you go back and look at eating habits, say, when I was growing up, say, in late 1940s, 1950s, Americans were eating a lot of things that today we would not consider to be very healthy foods. You know, there was a lot of consumption of bread, of potatoes, of pies, pastries, and yet obesity was much less. There was a book that came out several years ago that tried to argue that the obesity epidemic in America is an artifact of the way we're doing statistical measurements. I mean, come on. You know, all you have to do is look at old movies to see how the American phenotype has changed. Some years ago, I watched the whole World War II documentary by Ken Burns, and in that there are many scenes of enormous crowds of thousands of people, both civilian and military. You don't see any fat people. I mean, you sit in an airport today and look at what goes past. I mean, it's amazing. So what's changed in that time? Even though people in the 1940s and 1950s were eating foods, you know, mashed potatoes and gravy and lots of meat and this and that, they were eating real food. And I think this is a very striking difference, that the extent to which refined, processed, and manufactured food has displaced real food in the American diet is, I think, one of the most significant changes that has occurred, and is chiefly to blame for the rise of obesity, the rise of associated diseases, and many other kinds of chronic diseases in our society. The fatty acid composition of our bodies has changed, and here, this is the issue that I talked about earlier, that it is the increasing ratio of pro-inflammatory, pro-proliferative omega-6 fats in the human body relative to the anti-inflammatory, you know, anti-proliferative omega-3 fats that has changed. And so, you know, I have long argued that many, if not most, of the chronic degenerative diseases that kill and disable people prematurely in our society are rooted in chronic, low-level, purposeless, imperceptible inflammation. And I'll just repeat this for those of you who have heard it. Inflammation is the cornerstone of the body's healing response. It's the way the body gets more nourishment and immune activity to an area that's injured or under attack. But inflammation is so powerful and so potentially destructive that it's very important that it stay where it's supposed to stay and end when it's supposed to end. If inflammation escapes its boundaries of time and space, if it serves no purpose, it becomes productive of disease. You need to produce enough inflammation to protect you from infection, but you don't want to produce so much inflammation that you spill over into allergies and autoimmunity, or over time increase the risk of the so-called age-related diseases. It's very clear that coronary artery disease begins as inflammation in the lining of arteries. Alzheimer's disease begins as inflammation in the brain. Cancer is linked here because anything that increases inflammation simultaneously increases cell proliferation, and whenever cells proliferate more frequently, the risk of malignant transformation is increased. The reason that aspirin has a very significant cancer protective effect on cancers of the GI tract, for example, is that it is an anti-inflammatory agent. You cannot disentangle these two things. So I think you can argue that most people in our culture go through life in a pro-inflammatory state. A major reason for this is the increasing consumption of refined, processed, and manufactured food, and a major explanation of that is the changed fatty acid composition of foods that people are eating. around the same time the obesity epidemic started. So I think this is, this is the last of these slides from the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. I thought this was just fascinating to see this all put in graphic form like this so recently by a mainstream nutritional journal. I think that these very much illustrate the problems that we have in our culture today. So what do you do with all this? What then is an optimum diet? What can we agree on? I think we can all agree that an optimum diet is based in real food. That one of the soundest pieces of advice that we can give to our patients is to reduce and eventually try to eliminate consumption of refined, processed, and manufactured food. We have an enormous amount of data for the overall benefits of the Mediterranean diet as a way of eating associated with greatest longevity and lowest incidence of chronic disease. So I think that's a good place to start. The Mediterranean diet emphasizes olive oil as a primary cooking fat. Olive oil is unique among fats in having a significant anti-inflammatory component, a compound called oleocanthal, which accounts for the peppery bite in good olive oil. This has been shown to have an anti-inflammatory effect equivalent to ibuprofen. Interestingly enough, it was discovered by the man who developed ibuprofen, who was an olive oil fan, and noticed at olive oil tastings that the catch that he got at the back of his throat, which makes you cough, and some people experience as a peppery bite, was exactly the same sensation he got from swallowing powdered ibuprofen, and wondered whether there was something in olive oil that might have a similar effect, and it turns out to be this thing called oleocanthal. The Mediterranean diet emphasizes great consumption of good quality fruits and vegetables, and here I would say the emphasis should be on vegetables, because again, fruits are sugar sources, and I think that we should not be eating fruits in unlimited quantity, especially the high glycemic load tropical fruits. The government makes no distinction in telling people to eat more fruits and vegetables. I think it's most important to eat more vegetables. And I think that the information that we have on sugar is very important, and you want to pay attention to this. And a general recommendation for people is to reduce consumption of total sweeteners in the diet, to pay attention especially to fructose intake, and by looking at the relative percentages of fructose in common sweeteners. Again, maple syrup is lowest, agave is highest, table sugar is in the middle. And the easiest way to urge people to reduce sugar consumption and to reduce that trend that we saw there with that great spike is to reduce consumption of sweetened beverages of all sorts. I think the information on what are heart-healthy fats and what are not healthy fats, this is really revolutionary new information that has come out of contemporary nutritional science, something that we should all be paying attention to. So that's my, here at the end of 11 years of nutrition conferences and trying to give people advice about what to eat in an optimal diet. That's really, I think, as tightly as I can summarize it. Thank you. In looking at how to design a diet that would most effectively put you more in an anti-inflammatory state, I used the Mediterranean diet as a template and tweaked it a bit to make it even more effective.